Lane Community College presents the Lane Peace and Democracy Conference.
And can you really succeed in war in the first place? You know, is there such a thing as winning a war?
We have now surpassed the military budgets of the rest of the world combined.
The world can no longer entertain the delusion that the U.S. standard of living is possible for the entire planet.
I've tried the kumbaya, and we're all the same, and you know, that doesn't work anymore.
Just as war is too important to leave to the generals, civil liberties is too important to leave to the lawyers.
Women are standing up in these prestigious positions, and it's time.
We live in a society that is unequal, that is unjust, that is full of oppression and racism.
We need to commit to removal of all our forces.
And a favorite law enforcement tactic is to disturb a hive and then listen for the buzz.
You do not clear-cut forests to make toilet paper.
And then the riot police came in and told us, okay, everyone needs to stand in the sidewalk unless you want to get pepper sprayed or arrested.
And the Peace Center will be an important element in making a difference for ourselves, our community, and in time, the world.
And that all rights are equally important. The right not to be tortured or the right to vote is as important as the right to shelter and the right to food.
The biggest threat to humanity, it does come down to massive death.
Pepper spraying and shooting automatic rubber bullets into the crowd, so it sounded like machine gun, and everyone was pretty scared.
And our country has 1 out of every 100 of our people in jail.
The world economic system is destabilizing.
Terrorist acts are better treated as criminal acts with political implications rather than as an act of war.
The need to teach peace is obvious. The need to teach people other values besides war is obvious.
And if we leave it to a political party and a leader to decide whether to bring those troops home, they're not coming home.
My name's Stan Taylor. I'm one of the co-chairs for the conference, along with Peg Allison. Peg, are you here somewhere? You'll find the committee members who helped to put this event together all have armbands on with peace signs, the dove of peace on them, and those committee members worked long hours to put this event together. The Lane Peace Center itself came into existence as part of a discussion that started a few years ago here at Lane. And that discussion that started a few years ago was about how we're living in a world that is filled with war and militarism and the need to teach peace. And it doesn't take long to look around the world and see what the actions of the United States are doing in terms of causing destruction. I mean, if you look at the war in Iraq, for example, that's a country of 26 million people. And the latest research polls in Iraq show that about 1.3 million people have been killed in Iraq. 1,300,000 people out of 26 million people. And another 2.5 million people have been displaced out of their country into Syria and Jordan and surrounding countries. So another 2.5 million people have left their homes and left their country to get away from the war. And then another 2 million people in Iraq have left their homes and are internally displaced. That is, they have moved from one part of the country to another. Now, if you add all that up, what you'll find is that's about 6 million people out of a population of 26 million people. And if you were to begin to talk about similar numbers in the United States, we'd be talking, if that war were on us, 15 million dead, 29 million people who would have left the country, another 23 million who would have been internally displaced. I mean, imagine, we have a little less than 4 million people in Oregon, and we're talking numbers in Iraq that exceeds 6 million people either dead or displaced from their homes. Of course, if you begin to translate that back to the United States, we see that it has impacts here as well. I mean, from the beginning, what is happening is our society is becoming more militarized, and the values of militarization are being valorized, while the values of peace are falling into the background. The need to teach peace is obvious. The need to teach people other values besides war is obvious. Even in Eugene, if you begin to add up the amount of money that has been spent from Eugene taxpayers, according to the National Priorities Project, Eugene taxpayers have paid almost $150 million in taxes towards the war in Iraq. Imagine teachers, schools, the things that we're losing because we are supporting and using our tax dollars for these purposes. One of the themes of our conference is that peace is not built simply by taking to the streets and resisting war, but that it really is built on various types of justice: social, racial, economic, political, environmental justice. And the two speakers we have here today reflect that orientation. Bob Wing is a longtime activist in the civil rights movement. In fact, he's currently working in the Los Angeles area with community groups as Black Latino grassroots organization in South Central Los Angeles. But Bob Wing has done a lot of things. He was one of the persons who was instrumental in getting the ethnic studies program originally organized at the University of California, Berkeley. Pushed for it to be a third world university, I think, first before it became an ethnic studies program. He is one of the editors, or has been one of the founding editors of War Times and also of Colorline magazine, and written a lot of important articles. For example, The Structure of White Supremacy in the Election of 2000 and 2004, The Color of Abu Ghraib, and War, Racism, and the United Fronts in the post-9/11 era. I'm really proud to present Bob Wing to you.
So a long time ago, somebody told me I should try to tell a joke at the beginning of the speech, so I'm going to try to do that. So you know how airplane jokes go. This is a small jet flying over the Pacific Ocean, and all the engines on the plane go out. And so the pilot comes back to the passengers and said, we're sorry, the engines are out, the plane's going to go down, and there are only enough parachutes for the staff and 3 of you 4 passengers. So we're going to take the parachutes, and the staff is going to jump off, and we're going to leave it to you passengers to decide which of the 3 of the 4 of you get the parachutes. So the staff jumps off, and as soon as he does, the first guy gets up and he says, I'm the President of the United States. I'm the most powerful person in the most powerful country in the world. I should get a parachute. They say, okay. The second one gets up and he says, well, I'm the Pope. I'm the spiritual leader of hundreds of millions of people throughout the world. I should get a parachute. And they say, okay. And the third one says, well, I'm Dick Cheney. I'm vice president of the most powerful country in the world. I should get a parachute. And the fourth person, though, is a student from Lane Community College. And the student says, whoa, not so fast, Dick Cheney. You're old, I'm young, I have my whole life in front of me. I think I should get the parachute. And they get into this big struggle, and the kid won't give up. So finally, Cheney is like red in the face, and he says, I don't care what you say. I'm the smartest man in the world. He grabs the parachute, and he jumps out. And afterwards, the Pope goes to the kid and says, oh, I'm really so sorry it had to happen this way. Would you like me to say last rites for you before we jump off? And the kid says, hey, no problem. The smartest man in the world just grabbed my backpack and jumped out. Okay, that was the highlight of this speech. I should quit right now. So some of the topics I'm going to cover are over here, kind of more or less, sort of. I want to encourage you to stop if at any point somebody feels like they want to get some clarification or something, this is not going to be a super formal type speech. So if any of you at any time feel like you would like to raise your hand and ask something or make some remark or correct me, please do. So you can kind of tell by looking at me, I came of age in the 50s and 60s, and I can see that a good number of you did too. And I don't know about you, but probably the two biggest lessons I learned from that period were, one, that war and racism are like central to this country and really linked as the two worst features of this country. The war in Vietnam, the civil rights movement just brought all that to the fore. And the second thing I really learned was that under the right conditions, regular folks, if they get organized enough, can have a major impact on the direction of history. And over the years, I've been involved in many, many struggles, and they kind of go up and down. The 60s and 70s was obviously a highlight period, and it hasn't been quite like that recently. But now I want to tell you that I'm at one of my most optimistic periods of my life in terms of looking forward. And in a way, what I want to say is why I think that way. I don't think that we're on the verge of a revolution that's going to change everything rapidly. That's not what I'm trying to say. But I think we are in a period where regular folks, once again, have the chance to significantly change the direction of the country. I mean, if you look at it from 1968 until now, there have been only 2 Democratic presidents, and the politics of this country have gone so far to the right. The Republican president in 1968, Richard Nixon, if you put his politics on the map of politics today, would probably be center-left of the Democratic Party. And if you took Bill Clinton, one of the 2 Democratic presidents we had, and you put him on the map of politics in 1968, he would probably be center-right of the Republican Party in that time. That's how far politics have moved. And it's not just politics. I mean, that means war. That means poverty. That means doing away with the social safety net. That means there isn't health care. That means jobs go away. But we've had such a powerful shift to the right. And I think that for the first time in a long time, we're in a position to start a long and hopefully powerful motion in the other direction. So I'm going to try to justify this point of view, a little bit anyway. And really the key thing that has, I mean, it's certainly by far not the only issue, but the main issue that has set these conditions has been the war in Iraq and the movement against the war in Iraq. But let me just do a quick little review about some issues about war and racism in our little history in this country. Aha! So everybody knows we had slavery for a long time. But a lot of times we don't really stop to think how powerful slavery and racism was in our country. I mean, 4 of the first 6 presidents were slave owners. The author of the Declaration of Independence, the leader of the Revolutionary Army, the author of the U.S. Constitution. And this is something I can't go into in detail now, but you can ask me a question later about if you want. Our entire electoral system, especially the Electoral College, and the way congressional seats are set up, was specifically designed by the slaveholders to ensure that they dominated the presidency and the Congress. And that happened all the way up to the Civil War, and even until recently, the most reactionary plantation-based forces in the South have, and in fact, they had long time in the Democratic Party today and the Republican Party, are still a powerful force in American life. And this was even different than other countries that had slavery, which, you know, there were a lot more slaves, actually, in Cuba, Brazil, Latin America than there were in the United States. But there was still a very, very important difference which shows up in this. In Latin America, the independence struggles, the struggles against colonialism in Latin America and the Caribbean were pretty much, I think without exception, anti-slavery and anti-racist. So when those new countries were put together, they were put together by anti-slavery, anti-racist folks. Whereas our country, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, our country from the beginning was put together by primarily, first and foremost, by the slaveholders, so that people who were not white were not even defined as citizens of this country. And even until 1965 did not even have a semblance of full citizenship rights in this country. It's what has made racism so powerful in our country is that the leading economic and political forces in our country have had a fundamental stake in slavery and racism throughout the history of this country. And combined with a racist foreign policy. This country is a settler colonial power. From the beginning, its entire existence was based on fighting and killing and taking the land of Native Americans, or, for that matter, fighting other colonial powers so that they could take the land of Native Americans. So these two qualities, a very aggressive military aimed primarily at people of color with a very powerful racism internal to the process of the country, is what has been two of the most powerful forces shaping our country. Now, obviously, we have made some progress, major progress, but we still have, and I'm not going to go into this in a huge way, but we still have huge ways to go. And this is just one example. This slide is of the wealth gap. What year does it say? Anyway, it's fairly recent, 2001. The wealth gap, where the median wealth of whites in 2001 was $120,900, and the median wealth of people of color was $17,100. This is just an indicator. And at a different time in a different place, I might focus on how this has happened and why and what its mechanisms are today. But I guess that's not really what I'm going to do today. I just want to indicate the ongoing power of this, mainly to set the scene. Sorry. So, there was a time after the 60s and 70s where issues of race and war tended to recede a little bit. They would rise and fall. But with the attacks on the World Trade Center, war and racism came right back to the center of American politics. The president put that right on our agenda. I mean, he went over the top, threatening to attack as many as 60 countries, making preemptive strikes, including nuclear strikes, an official part of American foreign policy. And so we're back into a period where war and racism have emerged back into the center of American politics. The slide I've got there shows that really at this point, the biggest, if you want to call it racial, though it's not really totally racial issue, the biggest issue of inequality is not just what's inside the United States, but on a world scale. If you look at world poverty, in 2001, almost 3 billion people lived on less than $2 a day. That's more than half of the world's population. That means a per capita income of what, about $700 a year or less. Whereas the per capita income in the United States is $30,000 a year. So this is really where the center of world poverty lies primarily in what's often called the global south. And the wealthy countries have become wealthy by, in many ways, producing that poverty. So you take a country like the United States. I think that some of you have probably heard of the Millennium Project, where the wealthy countries in the world some years ago decided that they were going to finally supposedly attack world poverty, and they were going to try to halve the number of people in poverty, meaning $2 a day or less, in a 15-year period. Well, that whole program, once again, as always, has fallen flat. And, of course, led by the United States, that it gives the least money to this. Instead, what the United States does is it puts its money into war. Puts it into war. So, and this has come in a huge way in this period. So here's just what's happened even recently. Back in 2001, that was the last military budget approved under President Clinton. The military budget of the United States was approximately $280 billion. That was already an amount greater than the second, number 2 to number 19 in the world. If you added their military budgets, ours was larger. Look what's happened since 2001. So we're all the way up to $644 billion now. And now, as of actually 2 years ago, the U.S. military budget is greater than the military budget of the entire rest of the world combined. So, oh boy, it's we're putting more money than ever. And the cost of the Iraq war, Stan was talking about this, I'm going to run through some of the same numbers. We've spent, not allocated, we've allocated more than $500 billion. We've actually spent now $500 billion on the Iraq war. It's approximately now $5.6 billion per year, which is even more than we spent, even adjusted, in the war in Vietnam. And the overall estimate of the cost of the war by the time all is said and done by the Nobel Prize winner Joseph Stiglitz is $2.2 trillion, I don't even know what that means, $1 trillion. So this is a slide I did when we had spent 251 billion. We're now at 500. So you can now double these numbers, just as a sense of what alternatives we had to spending that $500 billion on the war in Iraq. $251 billion could pay for full funding for global anti-hunger efforts and, not or, and full funding for comprehensive worldwide anti-AIDS treatment and prevention programs, and full funding for every child in the world to have basic immunization. That's $251 billion. We've spent $500 billion on the war in Iraq. This is trying to give you a sense of what are the priorities of the powers that be in this country and what needs to change. If you look at it on a domestic level, this one you can actually just double the numbers because it's still at the $251 billion. This is what we could do with $251 billion in the United States. Build now, I guess it would be with $500 billion, about 4.6 million affordable housing units. Or you can read it. Can you all read that? Etc. So the priorities of this country are totally bent out of shape. And this is one of the results, as I said, of this long Republican, not just Republican, right-wing Republican rule, not even traditional conservative rule, but right-wing Republican rule. Here's another slide showing that. This again was in 2003, the discretionary budget, how much was spent on the military. At that time was $396. You can now put that up to $644. And I don't know what the education numbers and housing assistant numbers are, but I think that they've actually even fallen further behind since then. But you know, how they count these things, you never know. I mean, it's like, you know, there's a lot of things that probably should be counted that aren't. But in general, yeah, it does include that. So let's move on to the death toll in Iraq. Stan actually ran through these numbers, but they're always worth putting in front of ourselves again, just as a reminder of what's going on over there. This is the U.S. death toll, which actually, in historical sense for wars, is fairly low because we're fighting such a high-tech war over there. That's also why the spending is so great. High-tech wars cost even more than primarily, you know, hand-to-hand combat wars. So about 4,000 U.S. soldiers dead. This is February 25th. 40,000 wounded, and about 1 of 7 of all the soldiers who serve in Iraq, based on historical analysis and the analysis of the first few years of war, are expected to have mental problems to the level that they need treatment when they return. I think it was about a couple months ago, the analysis came out that said that 1/4 of all the homeless people in the United States of America are veterans. Most of them, of course, were veterans of the Vietnam War. So, and I think you all have heard about all the scandals about the underfunding of medical care for veterans. They're even having to close the main hospitals. It's just at the level of a scandal. We're sending kids over to fight this war and not supporting them when they get injured. The Iraq death toll is just, as Stan said, is absolutely staggering. We're now at approximately just under 90,000 who are where there is absolute paper documentation that they died directly from combat in the war. So this is a very modest number for that. This is where there's actual documentation for Iraqis who've died in combat. As Stan said, the number now, the best estimate out there for the total number of dead Iraqis dead from the war, not just from combat, but from all the collateral things that happened in the war, is about 1.2 million people. And as Stan said, about 2 million. There's 2 to 2.5 million internal refugees who've left the country, Iraqis displaced from their homes. And you can go on and on. It's over 50% unemployment. Only 1/3 of people have regular access to drinking water. And just life in Iraq is basically hell. We've turned Iraq into a serious hell. And of course, all of this was justified originally on the whole weapons of mass destruction thing. I mean, geez, that one is just so dead now that we don't even feel like we have to argue about it. But it's scandalous how this war was justified. Wasn't the first time. They did the same thing, by the way, in Vietnam, where they manufactured, those of you may remember, they manufactured an incident in the Gulf of Tonkin that supposedly where the Vietnamese had supposedly attacked a U.S. ship. Never happened. and that was the trigger for the actual declaration of the U.S. war on Vietnam, on North Vietnam. So this was a bigger lie, even, to trigger another war. And probably the single, at one level, one of the most important numbers of all in thinking about numbers about Iraq is that at least 80% of Iraqis want the U.S. out. So whatever the U.S. may say about how this helps Iraqis or not, and I suppose if they wanted to, they could at least try to pull some numbers out. I haven't seen very good ones that said that something positive is happening. Now they're trying to tell us the surge is working. The most important thing is that the overwhelming majority of Iraqis want the U.S. out. In fact, the 20% who are supportive of the United States, they're really only the Kurdish population. That's who the 20% is. And the Kurdish population is in the north of Iraq, and the reason why they support the U.S. is that the U.S. intervention has, for the first time, I think in history, actually created a significant area in which Kurds have power over their own lives. They've been one of those groups that have been divided up between different countries and seriously oppressed, whether in Turkey or in Iraq or in Iran. And for the first time, the U.S. intervention, because they were on the pro-U.S. side, the U.S. gave them control over the northern part of a certain part of the northern part of Iraq. And so you see this, and you hear about how there are these conflicts between the Kurds, the Sunnis, and the Shiites. And the Kurds are the only part of the population that supports the United States and Iraq. So for all the false reasons, I mean, why are we over there? There are more and less complicated explanations for that. I'm going to give a pretty simple one at this point that is probably more like the tip of the iceberg. This is a map of the U.S. military troops and bases around the world. It was actually done prior to the Iraq War. So the only countries at that time, I think this was 2002, the only countries that the United States had no troops in are the countries that are in white. There are just a little over 200 countries in the world, so that keeps changing. At that time, there were about 46 that had no military presence. The dark red are the places where they have major bases and even nuclear weapons, and the pink is where they have more minor bases. And the ones that have the red bars were the countries where the U.S. put in permanent bases since 9/11. If you map the war on terrorism, you basically mapped where there's oil in this world, oil and natural gas in this world. So they really should say the war on terrorism is the war for oil and natural gas. So as I said, pretty much everything that the administration wanted out of this war, the opposite has occurred. The U.S. went to war to gain more control over oil and natural resources and over those parts of the world. It is less popular and more hated than ever, not only in the areas that it went into, but throughout the world. And you can see, 5 minutes. Okay, great. And even in Iraq, where it was hoping to set up a regime dominated by secular Democrats who were in favor of the United States, instead, the Iraqi government that the U.S. is supporting there now is actually led by the people who, if they would have asked at the beginning of the war, if Saddam Hussein was the number one enemy of the United States in Iraq before the war, the number two enemy are exactly the people who are now installed in power in Iraq now, the fundamentalist Islamists. And so throughout this whole thing, basically every result they wanted, they got the opposite. The Iraq War has been a disaster, not just from the point of view of progressives who value human life and democracy, but even from the standpoint of the administration itself. It's been a disaster. And it has been a trigger for a change in public opinion across the board. And so we're coming up now, obviously, in a huge election year. And how many people are, super excited about the election? How many people are, medium excited about the election? How many people are, not excited about the election? Okay. Well, from my point of view, there's a lot at stake in the election. And these are some of the immediate issues, the war, etc. But for me, it's not so much the immediate issues that are most at stake. It's the direction of the country. As I said, from 1932 to 1968 was the period in which there was only one Republican president. This was the period in which the welfare state was built. the New Deal, and later the Great Society, the Civil Rights Revolution. From 1968 to 2004, as I said, there were really two Democratic presidents. One was a one-termer, Jimmy Carter. The other was Bill Clinton, who in a certain way, like Richard Nixon was a Republican during a Democratic period, most of his policies looked more like a Democrat. Well, Bill Clinton was a Democratic president in a Republican period, and most of his policies looked like Republican policies. We're now, in my opinion, at a critical point where we could put an end to the period of right-wing and Republican domination. I'm not talking about immediate nirvana, but I am talking about the end to a period that has caused death, destruction, and disfiguration to hundreds of millions of people around the world over the last 30 years, and the beginning, possibly, a lot depending on what we do, of a period that will not just elect a Democratic president, but we will open up the possibilities. I mean, how many of us 1 year ago would have thought that universal health care would be an issue in a presidential election this year? That's just one indication of how things are opening up. To me, the important thing about an election is not just who gets elected, but what people do and organize and move around during an election, and that can be followed up after an election. So on that note, I'm going to end with a joke and a quote. The last joke is this. A senator suddenly dies, and he goes up for judgment to St. Peter. And he says, well, which is it going to be, heaven or hell? And St. Peter says, well, we're not used to having many politicians up here. We're going to let you decide. You spend 24 hours in each one, and then you decide which one you want to go to forever. So he goes down to hell, and all his buddies are there, and they're out on the country club playing golf. And after the great round of golf in this beautiful country club, they have caviar and champagne and lobster for dinner. And he says, wow, So then after that, the 24 hours up, he goes to heaven. And up in heaven, people are floating around on clouds playing the harp, and it's beautiful, and it's wonderful, and it's calm, and it's peaceful. And the 24-hour ends, and he goes back to St. Peter. And St. Peter says, well, have you made your decision? He says, wow, they were both great, but I think I've chosen hell as my ultimate destination. So he says, okay, he goes to hell. He goes down there, and it's totally different. They're in salt mines. They're like, there's dirt and dust all over them. Their clothes are torn up. And he says, what happened? I was just here 24 hours ago, and it was totally different. And they said, oh, that's when we were campaigning. This is after you voted. So I will tell you I'm an Obama guy, not because I love Obama, but because he is the main agent for change in this election and gives us space to organize. And I want to end just with a final quote from Martin Luther King. We as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. When machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on the military than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. We are now in a position to start making that change again. Thank you very much.
We'll turn now to our second speaker as she gets set up on her microphone. Medea Benjamin. Medea Benjamin is the founder of Global Exchange. In fact, I first became aware of Medea Benjamin up in Seattle in 1999 at the World Trade Organization protest, which Global Exchange was heavily involved in. Medea is also the co-founder of Code Pink, and people may or may not know, but that organization has chapters in 250 cities around the world. Is that right, Medea? So it's reaching large numbers of people. It's a women's group that's been organizing against the war and pushing for the reorientation of budget priorities to focus on health care, education, housing, not war. And one of the things I find most impressive about Medea's work is her traveling to places where war is taking place. So she has traveled to Afghanistan and to Pakistan and met with families there and experienced it firsthand, the devastation that is taking place in those countries. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to Medea Benjamin.
So it's great to be here. I just want to make one little correction about Code Pink. It's not a women's organization. It's a women-initiated organization. And I want this lovely man here, a friend, to stand up and show you how beautiful men look in pink shirts. And we say that men who are willing to take direction from women and feel comfortable wearing pink are the best guys you're going to find. So that's a plug for you buying your T-shirts out at the table out there. How many of you have been involved in some anti-war activity? Raise your hand. Who has not come out to any anti-war activity here? Okay. And of those of you, well, let's make this an open general thing. Obviously, the peace movement has not been successful, or we wouldn't be still in a war in Iraq 5 years later on. So I'm going to talk today about some of the things we've been doing, but they're not enough, they're not good enough, they're not effective enough. We have failed as a movement to do our job. So let me start off first with talking about some of the obstacles, and maybe you can help me by yelling out, what do you think have been some of the problems in organizing an effective peace movement to stop this war? Apathy, that's a good one. I'd put that way up on the list. The Patriot Act, which means that people are afraid to get involved. Corporate-controlled media, no doubt about it. When we got into this war, it was with the cheerleading of the networks, the print media, most of the radio stations in this country. It was unbelievable how they became a propaganda arm of the government. What else? The fact that our democracy hasn't functioned, even with those obstacles inherent in it, the way it's supposed to, because we did vote in November 2006 for a new Congress, and that Congress was voted in with a mandate to end the war. Have they done that? So the war is a big business. There are a lot of weapons industries and now all the contractors that make a lot of money from this war. And it's ingrained because we don't have peace education in our schools, that war is always be with us. It's part of being human beings, which is not true. We can end war. We can stop this. But when you live in a society that's based on militaristic kind of values, you're not teaching your young people that. What else? That's absolutely critical. President and administration that doesn't listen and doesn't care. One would think in a society that is supposed to be run by the people, democracy, run by the people, of, for, by the people, that if the people rise up and say something, the government's supposed to listen. On February 15th, 2002, before the war began, we had more people out in this country and around the world than ever before in an anti-war showing in world history. Millions of people came out. It was astounding, the incredibly good organizing work we did with our brothers and sisters around the world. George Bush called it a focus group. You'd think he'd listen to a focus group. He didn't even listen to the focus group because they had wanted this war and used 9/11 as a justification, and so refused to listen to the people. What else? 9/11. Cover-up of 9/11, never being clear what happened at 9/11, who attacked us on 9/11, and then using 9/11 as the excuse to justify this constant war on terror, constant sense of fear to justify more violence. What else? Somebody in the back had one. So people came out over and over again. Is that what you mean? Saying no, going to anti-war demonstrations and nothing happened? Well, that's right. And those who cared enough to get off their butts and get out in the street and organize were organizing and organizing and organizing and organizing and didn't see any response. And so then you start feeling disempowered, you start feeling very cynical, you start getting very tired and depressed. the entire economic system based on the exploitation of others. You might have heard the columnist and economist Thomas Friedman, who often justifies the free market system, but he says some very brilliant things like you can't find McDonald's without McDonnell Douglas, meaning that the military system is tied into the economic system, and oftentimes, as we see in the case of Iraq, the military goes in there as the first wedge and opens things up then for the U.S. corporations, and especially around the oil companies. And we can call ourselves an oligopoly in this country because of the tight connections between the government and the oil companies. Attachment to our materialistic values. And there you can say we are 5% of the world's population, consuming 20 to 25% of the world's resources. If we continue to have this kind of wasteful lifestyle that we have, we will continue to find ourselves in the position of allowing governments to go into wars for not just oil, but the coming wars around other resources like water. So those are just some of the things that would be an obstacle. And let me just add some of my ones that haven't come out, which is that we, unlike in the days of Vietnam, today we don't have a draft. And this makes such a huge difference because oftentimes in this movement today, it's middle-aged people like myself and like a number of you out there who are the ones that are out in the front lines of this movement. And yes, there are some fabulous young people who are part of this movement, but you don't have that same kind of youth energy that you had when there was a draft. And this is well known by the powers that be, and that is one of the real reasons they don't want to bring back a draft, is because they know you put a draft on there and this country will be on fire with students all over and young people all over the place taking over their campuses, their administration buildings, being out in the streets with that kind of youthful energy that we are missing. So that is to say that there are so many obstacles to building this movement, but they're not excuses. They're obstacles that we should be able to overcome, and we haven't been. So I do want to say in this presentation that while I'm giving you some examples of what my group, Code Pink, and I'm also part of a group founded 20 years ago, Code Global Exchange, some of the things that we have done, but in this context of them not being good enough and effective enough. One of the other issues that comes up when you are part of this movement is that you are swift-boated. And you are swift-boated by always people saying, you're not supporting the troops. You're against the war. You're against the troops. So I want to start out with a slide to say, here we are surrounded by troops. And these are troops that I would say, former troops, are the best that we have, which is people who started a new organization called Iraq Veterans Against the War. Let's give them a hand, because we work very closely with them, and it's very important to us because we are constantly being accused of not supporting the troops. And we say, you know how much we support the troops? You know how much we love the troops? We love them so much we want them to be home in the arms of their loved ones and not fighting an illegal war. You know how much we love the troops? We love them so much we want to stop funding the war and instead fund the health care and the mental care and all the kind of care that they need when they get home, give them jobs, give them education, give them what they deserve when they get home. We love them so much that we don't want more young people recruited now into this immoral war. And we love them so much that we want to hold accountable I won't use the bad word, hold accountable those liars who got us into this war in the first place, impeach George Bush and impeach Dick Cheney. That's how much we love the troops. So, it is really important of all of this to be grounded in the sense of wanting to stop death and destruction, wanting to stop the death of our troops. But it's also really important to be grounded in this work in what has happened to the Iraqi people. And we've heard both from Stan and from Bob the statistics. And the statistics are absolutely devastating. I mean, think of how we talked about Saddam Hussein as the butcher, and there we talked about hundreds of thousands of being killed. Now we're talking about over 1 million people being killed. And these are real people with real families and real loved ones that are being killed. This is just one example. I've been to Iraq 5 times. I can't tell you how it hurts me what we have done to people that became my friends. I can't tell you how ashamed I am of my country for having destroyed the cradle of civilization. Under a brutal dictatorship, I never ever thought I would stand up on a podium in this country and say, we made things worse than they were under Saddam Hussein, and we certainly have. And shame on us for allowing that to happen. So this is a woman, a friend of ours, Vivian. She's a Christian living in Baghdad. She always loved the United States. There was fighting in her neighborhood. She got in her car with her husband, the first man there, and her children, and started desperately driving to find some safety. Came up on a roadblock, U.S. troops. They signaled something they didn't understand, and all of a sudden the shots started firing out. First, they shot her husband, who was in the car next to her. Then they shot in the back of the car and hit her sons. And then they shot the little baby that was sitting on her arms. And the bullet went right through the baby's forehead. And the mother watched her entire family being killed. Now, this is just one of the examples of the many, many, many thousands of people who've been killed in these, quote, accidents at the roadsides. This is another example of a sheikh that we met. And he told us that in one of those midnight raids where the U.S. troops break down the doors and go into the homes, that they often go with their guns pointed. And what did they do in his home? They went with their guns pointed. The father tried to get his wife and the children out of harm's way, and so started moving around, and immediately the soldiers pointed the gun and killed the father. This is the grandfather here. He is now taking care of these grandchildren. And he says, every day they wake up and they say, Baba, 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 where is my father? Where is my father? And he says, what am I supposed to say to them? And how do you think I feel about the U.S. troops now? And how do you think all the people that are my followers, because he's a religious leader, think about the troops right now? And he said to us, think about the enemies that you are creating every day that your troops remain in Iraq. We couldn't think of, what can we do when we hear stories like that? And one of the things we thought of doing is to find people that had also been harmed in the United States by these policies, the parents of soldiers who've been killed in the war, and go to them and say, we have to be the peacemakers. We have to make the bridges. We have to go to Iraq and try to seek out these people and tell them that we want a different kind of policy. And amazingly enough, we found family members willing to do that. This man in the front lost his son in Iraq. The woman standing next to me lost her 18-year-old son in Iraq. The one behind her lost her son in Iraq. This woman in the corner here, her son was a firefighter that was killed in 9/11. And she said, I've had enough of destruction and death and war, and I want to do something about it. I want to go on that trip. The woman in the back in the corner there, her son was also killed in Iraq. Imagine these incredible people who, in the depth of their own suffering, found it within them to say, I want to go to Iraq. And they told us, I want to take humanitarian aid with us to Iraq. And we raised $650,000 worth of humanitarian aid to take to the women and the children of Fallujah after the U.S. had destroyed that city. An absolutely amazing exchange. We spent the entire 10 days there just hugging and crying and showing the kind of compassion of suffering people to suffering people. The U.S. media didn't even cover this trip. Imagine that. But media from the rest of the world was with us there every day and showed that kind of compassion coming from both sides. One of the things that did come out of this is that everywhere we go, and I'm surprised they're not here today, we in Code Pink are followed by people who say we are traitors to the United States because we gave hundreds of thousands of aid to the enemy. And I say, are women and children the enemy? are families that happen to be living in Fallujah and lost their homes and lost their livelihoods and were living in camps without a roof over their head in the middle of winter, without food, without medicines. Those are our enemies? That is a very twisted mind to think that those people are our enemies. And so we're very proud of what we did, and we continue to give aid to women and children and innocent people whose lives have been so destroyed by our own policies, and we're very proud of doing it. We also thought, okay, how do we get these stories out? We bring people here. In this case, all the women in the front are Iraqi women who came to the United States and did a 100-city speaking tour to tell their own individual stories of how their lives have been destroyed by the presence of U.S. troops and how they represent Sunnis and Shias and even Kurds to say that the majority of Iraqi people want the troops to leave, and if this is supposed to be in democracy in the United States, why don't you listen to the people of Iraq who have been crying out and saying the only way we will end the violence and get to a point of reconciliation is if we are not occupied by over 100,000 foreign troops on our soil. The other thing we do is something called walk in their shoes, and we take shoes, baby shoes, adult shoes, used shoes. We go to secondhand stores, and you can go online on the Code Pink Alert website, and you can do this yourself. You can download tags that give you the names and the dates that people died and how they died. And we set up simple displays. You can have 20 pairs of shoes. You can have 1,000 pairs of shoes. We put them in front of libraries. We put them in front of schools. We put them in front of post offices. And we stand there on a weekday, on a Saturday, whenever, just to be a reminder and just to pay some tribute to the Iraqi people who have suffered so much from our occupation. I mentioned when we talked about the obstacles, how one of the obstacles is that we voted, we did our job, we voted in a new Congress, and they weren't responding. And so we in the group Code Pink decided that we were going to set up a house in Washington where people could come and go every single day to Capitol Hill and say, what the hell are you doing? The people spoke. Stop funding this war. And so this is an open invitation to any of you to please join us in Washington. Come for a week, come for 2 weeks, come for 4 days, whatever you can. There is free rent. It's an incredibly wonderful atmosphere in the house, but they need to see us every single day to say you're not doing what the people asked you to do. We have some friends in Congress. This is Congresswoman Lynn Woolsey and Barbara Lee. They started the Out of Iraq Caucus. They're also part of the Progressive Caucus. And so we do work with some members of Congress, but oftentimes we find ourselves on the other end where we have to really be pushing these Congress people. And so we do creative lobbying. And here is an example of our creative lobbying where we go in as victims of war, as, quote, collateral damage, and we occupy their offices just like we are occupying the country of Iraq. Sometimes we go even a little more extreme, and when they don't listen to us in their offices, we think, okay, where else can we go? Because we are desperate. Well, we go to their homes. And this is outside the home of Speaker Nancy Pelosi in San Francisco. In much of the country, they think, oh, Nancy Pelosi, a real leftist, a real liberal, and we're in San Francisco, and we say, what? Nancy Pelosi could, in one moment, not fund the war by not putting any more bills on the floor that have more money for this war. And instead, they use the excuse of not having enough votes. And so we say, we go right to her home and say, Nancy, call them by their first name. That kind of brings us to the same level. Nancy, stop funding the war. And Nancy, when she became speaker, she said, there are two things that are off the table: defunding the war and impeachment. And so we always go and set up a table outside her home, and on the table we always have cutting off the war, and you'll see impeachment on the table there. So we say, the people set the table, you're supposed to listen to what the people want you to do. We not only go to her home, we actually camp out outside her house. We have something called Camp Pelosi. We've done 2-week campouts. We sleep on the sidewalk right there. We set up a little mattress and right on the cement. And we do regular camp outside her home. Once Amy Goodman from Democracy Now! Asked Nancy Pelosi, who is it harder to deal with, the Republicans or Code Pink? And Nancy Pelosi went off on Code Pink. So we're putting a lot of pressure on her, not enough. We have to keep it up, but this is the kind of extremes we've engaged in. Another area that we think is so incredibly important to focus on is the issue that we have become known around the world as a country, the tortures, as a country that has sanctioned torture. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to live in a country that tortures anyone. I don't want to live in a country where the highest authorities in this country have said that torture is okay. And so one of the things that we have been doing is going to the hearings and going to the Justice Department and say, fair trials for all, no torture for all. And we've also been focusing on the issue of Guantanamo, which is a symbol of our inhumanity. 95% of the people who are in Guantanamo were never captured on the battlefield. They were actually paid for. We paid $5,000, $15,000 in bounty for people who were supposedly related to Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. We have not given those people, we haven't charged the vast majority of them. We have not given them fair trials. And so we are part of a movement that says not only no to torture and goes into the hearings in Congress like you see in this picture, but also we went to Guantanamo. This was last year. We took a group to Guantanamo, and among the people that we took were people who had family members in prison in Guantanamo, and a former prisoner who had been held for 3 years until he was released. No charges, no apologies, no nothing. This family here, the Deghaes family, their child had been this woman's child in Guantanamo for 5 years, never, ever, ever charged with anything. We helped to highlight that case, and one of the successes we have is that in just 2 months ago, Omar Deghaes was finally released from Guantanamo. Again, never charged with anything, and after 5 years of being held, came out blinded in one eye from torture that he had received. No apologies, no nothing, but at least he is now back with his family and his loved ones. We were absolutely appalled when we would go to the hearings and hear Alberto Gonzalez talk about how torture was justified. This was one of the beautiful examples of our extreme lobbying here when we got up with that banner that said, "I have nothing to hide except the truth." And we went every single week to the Justice Department and did protests every single week outside the Justice Department. And finally had a big party outside the Justice Department when we could say goodbye to Alberto Gonzalez, another successful campaign to get rid of an attorney general who sanctioned torture. Of course, now they just put another one in who sanctions torture as well. We also go to all of the hearings that have to do with veterans and with veterans' health care. And here is one where we tried to go up to the generals and talk to them about the lack of sufficient care for the troops when they come back home. And this is a picture of one of the Code Pink women, Desiree Feruz, who got up very close to Condoleezza Rice with a message that was very clear on her hands, which she had put fake blood on her hands. This picture went all around the world, all around the world. And the reason I include it here because one of the important things in doing this work is that when these pictures go around the world, people around the world understand that there is dissent within the United States. And they are so heartened to see people in the U.S. standing up to the Bush administration, standing up to the Secretary of State. And I think it's one of the most positive roles that we at Code Pink have been playing is sort of getting the message out to the rest of the world that not all people in this country have been in agreement with these policies. What other things can you do when you're desperate to try to stop a war? Well, another time-honored thing to do is hunger strikes. We have done more hunger strikes than I want to think about. Myself, I had never done a long-term hunger strike until now, and I did a 30-day hunger strike, which was very, very taxing on the health of many of us. But through the hunger strikes, we always push a little further. And one of the hunger strikes was when we heard Joseph Lieberman talking about attacking Iran. And we thought, oh my God, here we are in the midst of this horrendous quagmire in Iraq, and now they are talking about going to war with Iran. What can we do? And so we organized a hunger strike just to get Joseph Lieberman to meet with us and to meet with our Iranian friends to say, you cannot keep talking about going to war with Iran. We will not let you do that. And there's this woman, Leslie Angeline, who went every day into the office of Joseph Lieberman on a hunger strike for 24 days. And on the 24th day in his office, she collapsed on the floor of his office. Well, let me tell you, she didn't do that on purpose, but the next day when that picture of her being taken out by medics appeared on the front page of the Washington, D.C. newspapers, guess whose office called us to say they wanted to meet? Joseph Lieberman. And I must say that after that, he was a little bit more cautious about how he talked about Iran. So these things do have an impact. And it is important to show people like Joseph Lieberman that we won't just let him say publicly that war is the way to deal with differences with a country like Iran. We often find ourselves confronting the police. Sometimes we get away with it and smile and go on our merry way, and a lot of times we do get arrested. That's why we need more people coming, not that we want to get you arrested, but because so many of us now not only have trials that we're facing, but we get banned. We're not allowed to go back into the hearing rooms for a certain period of time. So that's why we need new people coming in. One of the things we use a lot is art and culture. This is one of my favorite, a group that found an old tank sitting around and painted it in pink camouflage. But people ask me oftentimes, how do you get the energy to keep doing this stuff? And I get it from the creativity of the people that we work with, because they do such marvelous, amazing kinds of things. This is an aerial photo that a group in Los Angeles did, getting hundreds of people. Those are all people sitting together saying women say no to war. Just another example of the creativity that we use. We do lots and lots of singing. We usually take songbooks out with us to the protest, so it's not just sitting around listening to speakers telling us how awful things are, but we're actually lifting each other's spirits through song. Here we are in front of the White House. It's illegal to actually sit in front of the White House like this, but when you get enough people, you can get away with doing a lot of things. And the pink helps. We also do things to bring people together in families and make some of these marches and protests fun so that it can be intergenerational. Here's some young people that have found interesting ways to use the pink on their bodies. They even got their dog all dressed up, so make it really a family affair. And in the end, I don't want to sound corny, but I think it is important to always go back to why we are doing this stuff. And it really is about future generations, and it's about children, and it's about building a world that we feel comfortable to leaving to future generations. I am a mother. I have 2 lovely daughters. I certainly want to leave the world in better shape for them than it is now. And it's with the knowledge and understanding that the direction that we're going in now, by trying to use weapons and aggression and domination as a way to instill fear in the rest of the world, will somehow enhance our security. We just look at what has happened since 9/11, and we see with the incredible increase in military expenditure, the incredible sacrifice of our soldiers, the incredible destruction that we have wreaked on other parts of the world, we are less safe than we were then. And that if we are indeed to get safe in this world, to be safe with our families and our communities and as a nation, It really is by a revolutionary transformation in the way we deal with people around the world. It's not through an us versus them. It's not through domination. It's through showing that we care about people in the rest of the world, showing that their children are as important to us as our children are, showing that we feel that we are part of one beautiful human family, showing love, showing compassion, showing kindness to the rest of the world. That will make us infinitely more safe at home than any of the policies of the Bush administration. So let's not be depressed by what we haven't been able to achieve. Let's be excited, as Bob said, by the opportunities there are now with the new elections coming up, with the energy we feel, with the energy that we still have by coming to a conference like this, that we can change the face of American policy overseas, and we can change the priorities of our government here at home. Thank you so much.